Start now?
Yeah.
I guess so. Okay. Today is Rosh Chodesh Nissan, and it's also we're entering, so to say, the air period close to Pesach. So I felt that it would be appropriate to discuss the part of the Hagaddah that discusses Rosh Chodesh Nissan. And next week we'll go more into the Hagaddah. Now in the Hagaddah we say yachol meiRosh Chodesh v'Hagaddah Levincha. You should tell over or communicate to your children the events that took place in Egypt about the Exodus. So I would think that the mitzvah should begin on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. So Talmud Lomar Bayomahu. So the Hagaddah says no. It has to be on that day. It has to be on the 15th of Nissan. So yachol mevod yom. So I would think that the mitzvah of Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim, of conveying to your children and to others, you could do it a little earlier. You could start, because we know the way they mention the name of Reb Chaim, there's a mitzvah of Tosfos Yontif. Just like there's a mitzvah, according to most shitos of Tosfos Shabbos, of adding to Shabbos. So I would think that since you could add to Yontif, maybe you should be able to say the Hagaddah at that time also. Bavur zeh. No. Because of this, because of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, God took me out of Egypt. So the only time is there a mitzvah of Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim, of conveying the significance of the night of Pesach as the anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt, is at the time there's a mitzvah to eat matzah, to eat the Korban Pesach. Be'erev tochlu matzos. It's only when nightfall comes that there is a mitzvah. So, but if not for these psukim, I would have thought, according to the Hagaddah, that the mitzvah of Sipu Yetzias Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of giving over to your children, to those that are assembled at the Seder, to yourself, begins on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. And the question arises, why would I have thought that it begins on Rosh Chodesh Nissan? Why Rosh Chodesh Nissan? And there are a number of answers to this question. In fact, almost all the commentaries discuss this question. I want to first mention an answer that my father would mention every year at the Seder. There were certain thoughts that my father would mention at the Seder, each a different thought, a different year, but there were certain thoughts that he would repeat year after year after year. And we certainly were aware of them, but apparently he felt there was a need to emphasize these points. So I want to mention, and this thought was one of those thoughts that he would express year after year after year. So apparently he felt that it was very important. And my father said, Rashi at the beginning of Chumash Bereishis, I've mentioned it before, says, Lo haya haTorah tzarech lahaschil ela mehachodesh hazel lachem rosh chadashim shehi mitzvah rishona shnitna liyisrael. The Torah did not have to start, Rashi asks, with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz, with God creating heaven and earth. According to the Ramban, that would have been sufficient to have included that in the Torah Shebal Peh, in the oral tradition. And according to others, we could suggest that the Torah is not a history book. It's a book of Jewish law. So if it was to mention Bereshis bara Elokim, it's not telling me about creation, but is telling me about the belief in creation. So that could have come later. But since it's a book of Jewish law, the Torah should have started off with the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. And the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people was the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, which was given on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. And which is the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim? That's the mitzvah of declaring the new month, the mitzvah of the calendar. In ancient times, when we had smuchim, so at that time, it would be based on the sighting of the moon. And the Bezdin, representing the Jewish people, would proclaim Mekudesh, 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 when they received testimony that the new moon was sighted. They would declare the new month as having taken effect in the calendar. Later on, because the chain of the Masorah with smuchim, with certain ordained scholars, came to an end. So the calendar was instituted. And even when the calendar is instituted, the only reason, according to the Rambam, that the calendar is affected is because the Jewish people accepted the calendar upon themselves. It's the Jewish people who declared the new month. And because of this, the first mitzvah of the Torah, is HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah of proclaiming the new month, of following the calendar, or accepting the calendar. And the question is, so in a sense, this was the first mitzvah. It's true. There are other mitzvahs in the Torah. There is mitzvah of Pruvu that's mentioned earlier, Gid Hanosha that's mentioned earlier. But so why does Rashi say that HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah of the calendar, is the first mitzvah of the Torah? The answer is because the mitzvahs that I mentioned earlier, they are only effective today because those parshios, those sections of the Torah, were repeated to Moshe Rabbeinu at Mount Sinai. But all the laws that were given before the time of Moshe Rabbeinu are only in effect today because they were repeated to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the first mitzvah that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, given to the Jewish people as a nation, was the mitzvah of proclaiming the new month, the mitzvah of the calendar. So, in a sense, HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim is the first mitzvah that the Jewish people received. Now, in a sense, although the bulk of Matan Torah, the bulk of the Torah was given over at Sinai, the first mitzvah given over was HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim. And in a sense, this represents the beginning of the spiritual Geula, the spiritual redemption. The Jewish people had both a spiritual redemption and a physical redemption. The physical redemption took place on the 15th at night, when Paro told the Jewish people, leave. But the spiritual redemption that began with the Torah was first given to the Jewish people. And the first mitzvah of the Torah to be given to the Jewish people was Chodesh Hazelachem Rosh Chodesh. And it is obvious that the spiritual Gula, the spiritual redemption, is more important than the physical redemption, although, of course, both are necessary. And very often, to a large degree, the physical redemption, the physical freedom has been torn away from us throughout our years of exile. We suffered torture, we suffered slavery, and worse. But the one thing they were not able to take away from us was the Torah heritage, the spiritual redemption of the Jewish people. And because of that, logic would have dictated, my father said, that we should talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim, talk about the Exodus from Egypt on Rosh Chodesh Nissan, when the spiritual redemption took place. But the pasuk comes and says, Bayomahu, only on that day. Only when the matzah and maror are in front of you, when there's a mitzvah of matzah and maror. Why? Because the Torah wants us to combine the spiritual redemption together with the physical redemption. Now, my father's answer is based on the premise that the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim was given on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. However, when one takes a look at Rashi, it's obvious that actually HaChodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim was not given on Rosh Chodesh Nissan, but it was given on the last day of Adar, because Rashi says that God spoke to Moshe in the day, but he mentions, the meiRosh says, that God showed Moshe the moon, what size the moon has to be in order to declare Rosh Chodesh. So Rashi says, God spoke to Moshe at the end of the last day of Adar, and Moshe immediately saw the crescent of the moon as soon as the evening began. In other words, God spoke to Moshe in the last moment of the day, and he saw the moon at the first moment of the night. Now, the first moment of the night, that was Rosh Chodesh Nissan. So the oral command about proclaiming Rosh Chodesh must have been given to Moshe during the day while it was still Adar. So the giving of the Torah did not begin on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. It began toward the evening of the last day of Adar. So the question is, how are we to understand my father's answer? And I think that the answer could be understood in the following manner. There is the giving of the Torah and the receiving of the Torah. At what point is it considered that the Jews received the Torah? Not necessarily when the command was given, but when the command was fulfilled. And it was only when the proclamation of the new month took effect, that the Jewish people as a nation fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, of sanctifying the new month. And that took place at night. And it's interesting, in Parshas Yisro, Rashi mentions that Yisro had many names. One of them is Yeser. Yeser means something more extra, because he added a portion to the Torah. It was Yisro's suggestion to Moshe to adopt the court system that caused an extra portion, Parshas Yisro, to be added. So he had the name Yeser. But then Rashi says, but when he went through conversion and he fulfilled the mitzvos, they added a vav to his name. And the question is, it seems very strange, because Yisro added a portion to the Torah. It seems that it was after Yom Kippur, after he came. There is some discussion as to when Yisro actually came in the meiRosh. But from the meiRosh, it seems that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he brought down the second luchos, so the next day, he sat lishpot esam, to judge the people, to teach them Torah. And the people were standing from morning to evening. And then Yisro said to Moshe, you will not be able to survive this. The people will not be able to survive this. You will have to enact, or get God's permission, ask God, I should say, whether you should enact a court system. And the most difficult questions that the judges are not able to arbitrate or to decide, those questions will be given to you. So that happened long after Yisro came, and we get the impression that Yisro underwent conversion to Judaism shortly after he came. So what does it mean? First, he had the name Yeser, adding a portion to the Torah, and then when he went through Geirus and fulfilled the mitzvos, he got a vav, an added vav. But there are all kinds of indications that a ger, besides the fact that he has to go through the ritual of Geirus, let it be circumcision, let it be going to the mikveh, let it be the acceptance of Torah. In order to become a Jew, besides that, there is a mitzvah of Geirus. He fulfills a mitzvah when he undergoes conversion. And the mitzvah of Geirus, one fulfills in terms of the acceptance of the mitzvos. Not when he says, I accept the mitzvos, I will do the mitzvos. But when it's determined that he changed his lifestyle and he accepted a lifestyle of mitzvos. Because the true acceptance of mitzvos doesn't manifest itself only in standing in front of the Beis Din and saying, I accept the mitzvos. But the ultimate true acceptance of mitzvos is living a life of mitzvos. And in a sense, this is when what Rosh Chodesh Nissan is the beginning, not so much the beginning of the giving of the Torah, but it's the beginning of the accepting of the Torah. And the Jewish people accepted the Torah and Rosh Chodesh Nissan. It is not the requirement to observe the mitzvos that made us spiritually redeemed. That was our spiritual freedom. It's actualizing the acceptance of the mitzvos, fulfilling the mitzvos. So because of that, Rosh Chodesh Nissan is the day that commemorates the beginning of the acceptance of Torah. And because of that, it represents the beginning of the spiritual gula, the spiritual redemption. So if not for a pasuk saying to the contrary, that I have to couple talking about the spiritual gula, the spiritual redemption, with the physical redemption, I have to combine the two. I would say that the mitzvah of talking about the Exodus begins on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. So Talmud Lomar Bayomahu. Because of this, the Torah tells us it has to be, the mitzvah is only on the 15th of Nisan. Now, but I want to suggest, I have a number of answers to this question, alternative answers. I want to suggest an answer that I previously have not suggested. When you take a look at the Sforna, on Chodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, the Sforna says that the mitzvah of proclaiming the new month, that was part of the process of freeing of the Jew. The month is theirs. In order to feel free, they had to, in a sense, be in charge of time. Now, I want to try to understand the significance of this idea of being a master of time. And I want to understand what is the connection between being a master of time and, in a sense, being a master of time and being free. And why was being in control of time, and the Jewish people are in control of time, because we proclaim the new months. When it comes to Shabbos, the Kiddush of Shabbos, we say Mekadesh Shabbos. God sanctifies the Shabbos. But when it comes to Yom Tov, we say Mekadesh Yisrael B'Hazmanim. God sanctifies the Jewish people who sanctify the times. We proclaim Rosh Chodesh. And when we proclaim Rosh Chodesh, when we proclaim the new month, we are in effect proclaiming when the holidays are going to take place. So it is the Jewish people who proclaim the holidays. And that's indicative of the Jewish people being masters of time. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi said, my father would always mention it, my mother also would always mention it. Avdei Hazman Heim Avodim LaAvodim. The servants of time are the slaves of slaves. But the servants of God, they are truly free. So being a servant of time, a slave of time, that's indicative of Avdus. That's indicative of slavery. But being a master of time, it would follow, would then be this show freedom. Now it's interesting, there is a when you take a look at the halachos of Pesach, the way we have to act at the Seder, you take the best dishes that you have. It's brought down that the Maharil, apparently he was in the lending business, and many non-Jews would give him some of their finest dishes to hold till they paid back their debt. So he would put these dishes, didn't use them obviously, on the table by the Seder, because it showed Cheres was demonstrative of freedom. So Pesach, we go to the extreme in demonstrating our freedom. We lean. There is even a custom, has to be understood. Some have a custom that you don't pour your own wine, that another person pours the wine in the cup for you. In fact, in a sense, we act like royalty on Pesach night. So what is the reason for this extreme form of demonstrative chaos? Now, it's very interesting. There's a discussion in the Gemara, in the Yerushalmi, in the meiRosh, why we observe, why there are 4 cups Pesach night. Many say it's based on the pasuk in Ve'era, Votzeisi, V'galti, V'hitzalti, V'lakachti, corresponding with the 4 expressions of redemption that God told Moshe to tell the Jewish people, that in telling them about redeeming them from slavery and taking them out of Egypt. But there are other reasons mentioned. In the Yerushalmi and the meiRosh Rabbah, they mention the name Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, another reason. And that is based on a pasuk in Vayeshev, when Yosef is taken, thrown into prison in Egypt, and in the Egyptian prison, he's together with the Sar Hamashkim, the butler of Paro. But it seems from the Chumash, it wasn't the common butler. He had a very, very significant position in the Egyptian hierarchy. And he tells his dream, and Yosef ultimately tells him that Paro is going to free him and it will return him to his position. And in discussing the dream, so the Sar Hamashkim, the butler, the so-called butler of Paro, he makes expression of the kos Paro biyadi, the cup of Paro is in my hand. And then he says, and I take the grapes, press them, I take the grapes and I press them and into the cup of Paro. And then I place the cup in Paro's hand. And then Yosef, so 3 times in the dream, in expressing the dream, the Sar Hamashkim, the butler of Paro, uses the word kos Paro, the cup of Paro. And then Yosef, when he interprets the dream, he mentions 1 time the word kos Paro, the cup of Paro. He mentions it 1 time. So he says, "V'nasata kos Paro biyodo," you shall put the cup of Paro in his hand. And the question is, and because the word kos Paro, the Yerushalmi says, is mentioned 4 times. There's a different version of this Xeris HaKasav and Rashi. But in the way it's mentioned in the Yerushalmi and the meiRosh Rabbah, the word kos Paro is mentioned 4 times. The cup of Paro is mentioned 4 times. Corresponding with these 4 times, we have 4 cups. And the question is, why is it that the 4 cups of wine are identified with the 4 cups, the 4 times Kos Paro, the cup of Paro is mentioned? Now, when we take a look in Parshas Va'era, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu complained to God about the fact that the Jewish people were not immediately redeemed. On the contrary, their burden became heavier. And at the end of Parsha Shemos, Moshe Rabbeinu says, "V'hatzil lo hitzaltas amecha," you didn't save the people. So God tells Moshe, go tell the people that I am going to redeem them. And the Torah says, Moshe gives over the message to the Jewish people. Vayedaber Moshe kein el bnei Yisrael. Moshe spoke to the Jewish people. V'lo shomu el Moshe. They did not heed Moshe because of shortness of breath and hard work. In other words, because of the bondage, they saw themselves as slaves. They couldn't perceive themselves as being free anymore. So then God says to Moshe, go to Paro, the king of Egypt, and tell him to let the Jewish people out of Egypt. So Moshe Rabbeinu makes a kal v'chomer. He says, if the Jewish people didn't listen to me, do you think Paro will listen to me? And this is a kal v'chomer. It's a logical statement. In other words, the more a person cannot perceive himself as being free from the bondage of his master, the more the master cannot see himself freeing the slave. Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai. The Jewish people didn't listen to me. V'eich yishme'eni Paro. How can I expect Paro to listen to me to set the Jewish people out? So what was God's answer? God's answer, it's a logical question. V'yedaber Hashem al Moshe Aaron v'yetzavem al b'nei Yisrael. He commanded them to the Jewish people. V'al Paro melech Mitzrayim lahotzias b'nei Yisrael Mitzrayim. He commanded them not just to Paro, to speak to Paro, to speak to the Jewish people, to let the Jewish people out of Egypt. So in other words, the redemption requires not just forcing Paro, twisting Paro's hand to let the Jewish people out of Egypt. But part of the redemption is that the Jewish people should play a role, should be able to recognize that they might be able to go free, that they will go free. Because so long as the Jewish people cannot perceive themselves as being free, Paro will not be able to perceive himself as freeing them. So I think, and to a certain degree, the Jewish people had this servile perspective. They had this servile perspective. And why was it necessary? This week is Parshas Vayikra. Why was it necessary for the Korban Pesach in Egypt, to take the lamb and to slaughter the lamb in front of the Egyptians, many of whom worshiped the lamb. There seemed to have been many different groups in Egypt at that time. Why was it necessary? Because until the Jewish people could slaughter the lamb in front of their Egyptian oppressors, they still remained mentally slaves to Egypt. And so long as they were mental slaves, they had a servile perspective of themselves, they wouldn't be able to go free. So the purpose of the Korban, and it's interesting that the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he discusses the reason for Karbanos, I'm not going into all the details this time, but when he discusses the reason for Karbanos, he says that many of the animals that are used, or domesticated animals that were used for Karbanos, for sacrifices, these were animals that were worshipped by the idolatrous nations at that time. So in a sense, to a certain degree, according to the Rambam, part of the purpose of Karbanos was a negation of this form of idolatry. But the Jewish people had to do it not just to negate idolatry, but they had to negate idolatry in front of the Egyptians in order to show, that they should come to understand that the Egyptians are no longer their masters. And this is, and it's very interesting meiRosh Rabbah. But the question is that we have to understand is, how does one, and also we know that the Jewish people, before they left Egypt, they had to go and take the rechush, they had to take the possessions of the Egyptians. And the question is, why was it necessary? Gemara in Brachos mentions that the Jewish people might have been, would have told Paro, God told Moshe, please ask them. I gave a commitment to Avram, to Abraham, that they will go out with great wealth. Why was it necessary for God to ask Moshe? But the answer is, if you have a slave and he has his chance to run, he might run and say, forget about the rechush, at least initially. Forget about the wealth of Egypt. I just want to get out of here. So because of that, God, but why was it important for Avram that the Jewish people should take the wealth of Egypt? On the contrary, the question is stronger. But the answer is, it was important for them to take the wealth out of Egypt in a sense to show that they are not slaves of Paro anymore. And that's the idea of, so they took the wealth of Egypt. They were no longer the slaves. The slave doesn't have anything. Everything belongs to the master. And they take the wealth that belonged to their former master. That shows that they're no longer slaves. And I think that perhaps could be the understanding of the Yerushalmi, because Paro biyadi, the cup of Paro, the leader of Egypt, the master of all of the people of Egypt, the one who enslaved the Jewish people. All of that, Paro was still seen mentally as their master. And to a certain degree, even when the Jews left Egypt, meiRosh mentions they didn't express, they didn't sing Ashira till the Yam. Why not? Because they were scared. Paro might still be running after them. The idea of taking the Kos Paro is that Paro is not my master. I am my own master. The symbol of the Kos was the symbol of being the ruler, the master. So the 4 times Kos Paro is mentioned. The cup of Pharaoh is mentioned. We drink 4 cups to say, Paro is no longer my master. I am my own master. And we can understand this a lot better with a medrash in Parshas Chayesara. The medrash in Chayesara says that Rabbi Akiva was giving a drasha. This is a problem. Everybody, including myself, who gives drashas, we encounter. People that are listening to the drashas sometimes begin to fall asleep. On Zoom, I don't have that problem because I can't see the people. But sometimes, so BK Slower Run, he wanted to wake them up, that they shouldn't doze off in the middle of his speech. So, in the middle of his lecture, I should say. So he said, what did Esther see that she should rule over 127 states? Elatovo Esther, let Esther come. He's Bazbita Shosore Menu, that she is the descendant of Sarah, who lived 127 years and rule over 127 states. How are we to understand this? How are we to understand it? But the answer is, what is Sarah living 127 years have to do with Esther ruling over 127 states? But the answer, I think, is very simple. Vayu Chaye Sarah, the first pasuk says the life of Sarah was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. So Rashi says, based on the Medrash, others explain the Medrash a little differently, but that at the age of 20, Sarah had traits that are associated with the age of 7. And at the age of 100, she had traits that were associated with the age of 20. What does that mean? That means that there are traits that are associated with different stages of life. Youth has positive traits and negative traits. Youth is identified with innocence on one hand, on the other hand, it's identified with immaturity. And when you go from one stage of life to the other stage of life, you drop the traits of one stage and you get the traits of the other stages, both negative and positive, because that's something that time, an imposition that time makes upon us. There's a wedge, and we are subject to the rule of time. And when we go into middle age, it's not so easy to take that same sense of innocence and bring it with us into the next stage of life. But Sarah Imenu, she was able to take the positive traits of one stage of life and bring it to the other stage of life. Why? Because Sarah was not governed by time. She wasn't the slave of time. Time did not rule over her. She ruled over time. And that's why Sarah was able to give over a tradition, because if you rule over time, you rule over yourself, and others are not able to rule over you. And that was the tradition that Sarah passed on to Esther. And certainly before you rule others, you have to be able to rule over yourself. You have to be your own master, and you only become your own master if you become a master of time. And the way, so this is what the Medrash This is what the meiRosh tells us. And we find the same thing about the Hagaddah. I mentioned when Abraham was going to the binding of Yitzchak, and Vayaras hamakam meiRosh, he saw God from afar. He saw what did he see? He saw a heavenly cloud, the meiRosh says, and from afar, and he's turned to Yitzchak, and he said to Yitzchak, what do you see? Yitzchak said, I see a nice mountain with a heavenly cloud. Then he talked to his two servants, and he said to them, what do you see? And the servants said, we don't see anything. He said, Shvulachem poem chamor. The chamor, the donkey, doesn't see anything. You don't see anything. You stay here with the donkey. But Vani Vanar, me and the lad, Yitzchak, who see the heavenly cloud from afar. We will go, we will serve God, and then we will return to you. And the Dasken Baal Tosfos says, that's why servants, slaves, halachically do not have pedigree. Their children are not considered their children to a certain degree. So the question is, what's the connection? But the answer is that when it comes, a slave does not have a past. Usually he is sold away from his parents. His parents are sold away from him. He doesn't have a future. His children are sold away from him. All he has is the fleeting moment of the present. Where am I going to get my next meal? But a free person uses that fleeting moment of the present to connect past, present, and future. One of the servants of Avram that went with him to the Hagaddah was Eliezer. Eliezer was a great person. But what happened to Eliezer? What happened to the house of Eliezer? A slave only has a present. There is no future. They were servants. They were great in that moment. But a free person has a heritage of the past. He looks forward to the future, and he connects it by seizing the fleeting moment of the present to connect the two. And in a sense, I saw it just the other day, that the same idea that I expressed by the Hagaddah, my uncle expressed in regard when he writes about slavery. He says, a slave, he does not have time awareness. A slave lives in time. He doesn't live time. He says he has no heritage, no past. Like I said also, he says he doesn't look forward to a future. It's memories. In order to live time, you have to have memories, but it has to be memories that become part of your present, that you're going to transmit to your future. But memories that you do not, that are just in the past, my uncle called it, that's archaeology. That if it's not part of the present and it's not transmitted to the future, that's living in time. That's not living time. We have to be able to experience the past and to a certain degree, see the light of the future. Pesach, we bring it all together. This is the idea of being a master of time, of past, present, and future. And with Jewish people, to a certain degree, even when they left Egypt, they did not have that freedom perspective completely. Rosh, the maidservant at the sea, saw more revelation than Yecheskel ben Buzi. But we know what happened to Yecheskel ben Buzi, but what happened to the maidservant at the sea? The answer is she saw it, but it was only in the present, in the fleeting moment of the present, when she moved away from the Yam, when she moved away from the splitting of the sea. That became part of the past. That was archaeology. It didn't have anything to do with the present. And I think that's the idea. What is the mitzvah? What is the mitzvah of Chodesh Elachem Rosh Chodeshim? What does it represent? As the Sforna says, it represents that we are in control of time. We proclaim the new month. Shabbos, God proclaims. But proclaiming the new month, that is the proclamation. That is the proclamation of the Jewish people. Mekadesh Yisrael Vazmanim. God sanctifies the Jewish people who sanctify the new month. So in a sense, our freedom began on Rosh Chodesh Nissan. Our freedom represents how the first step in freedom, it seems from the Seforna, is the fact that we are in control of time. We are masters of time. And the way that we become masters of time is being Avdei Hashem, by serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By HaKadosh Baruch Hu, past, present, and future is all one. And to a certain degree, we have to rise over the limitations that time places upon us. So I would think, since the freedom of the Jew began Rosh Chodesh Nissan, when God proclaimed the Jewish people as the masters of time. So the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is a mitzvah of talking about our freedom, should also begin on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Talmud Lomar Bayamahu. So we have a special Zeres HaKosov that tells us that we have to do it when we have the Matzah Mara Menachem Lefanecha, because that emphasizes Pesach Matzah Mara, that emphasizes the idea of being the servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of being in the service of God. And Avdei HaKadosh Baruch Hu Heim Rak B'nei Chorim, the servants of God, they are truly free. Okay.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat for us to ask. Okay, the first question is, can the rabbi comment on our experience leaving Mitzrayim as opposed to the woke movement, that we were nonviolent redemption and freedom versus the violence and forced conscription of property practiced by the progressives today?
Sometimes riots, being free has to manifest itself in man acting in a higher manner. And when you just riot for the sake of destruction and rioting without any real purpose other than destruction, so on the contrary, you show that you still have the serval perspective. You might have something against your former masters, but you have a serval perspective. You're not doing anything to raise yourself.
Any other questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, I guess it was very. Oh. Could you answer the question about receiving the mitzvah of HaChodesh during daytime or nighttime by saying that Bein Hashmashos is not a din safek?
Okay. My feeling is that the answer is that Now we can ask a question. Rashi in Bereshis, he says that God completed creation at the very last moment of the sixth day and rested on the very first moment of the seventh day. Something that man couldn't possibly understand or do. So the question is, if we say that Bein Hashmashos is a din safek, so how is that possible? Because you have a period, those who say let me explain, there's a twilight period that according to some opinions, it's not that we don't know if it's day or night. It was created as having elements of day and elements of night. So because of that, there is there is a period. If Eliyahu Hanavi will come and you'll ask him, is this twilight period day or night? He'll say, it's safek, it's a doubt. It was created as a doubt. I'll explain, there are certain human beings, very rare, that they have the organs of both male and female. And if you'll ask Eliyahu Hanavi, is he a male or a female? Eliyahu Hanavi will say, he's a safek. He was created as a safek. There is a doubt. Today, of course, you could just proclaim yourself being one. But he was created as a doubt. So the Bein Hashmashos, so the way they understand it is the Bein Hashmashos it was created as a doubt. Even Eliyahu Hanavi will not be able to tell us if it's day or night. But that's not the way. That's the way my father understood it, and that's the way my uncle understood it. I understood din safek that it's a doubt. It's not that it was created with elements of day and elements of night. I think that the Torah, the halacha, created a border, not creation, but the halacha created a border between day and night. And that was Bein Hashmashos. And that border is halachically considered doubt of day or night. But that only took effect at the time of Matan Torah. And until the time of Matan Torah, there was a definitive line that separated certain day from certain night. There was no twilight period in between.
Okay.
There are other answers to that question also, but I would have to give a long share.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Rabbi, for the share. God willing, next week it'll be another Hagaddah share. And just to remind people in Israel, in Chicago, in the United States here, we changed our clocks already last night, earlier today. So
they might be coming on now.
Right, so it's 12 o'clock here already in Chicago. So have a great week, everyone. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov, and good luck with your Pesach preparations.